Hi guys, I wanted to show you how to put underlining in your suits. It's something that I always put in my suits. It adds some thickness and body to the suit, which really helps, especially depending on the fabric choices that you have for your main garment, your main fabric. And it also has a number of really helpful benefits beyond just adding thickness. So I'm going to show you how I do my underlining. I'm going to show you the benefits that go with it, including being able to hand sew on that underlining layer, and also a way to do interfacing as an underlining too, that you sew in and you don't have to fuse. Alright, so I'll get ready to show you. Let's see if I can go. Alright. So here, underlining basically is taking your pattern pieces, and then every pattern piece that you have for your main or your fashion fabric, I'm using a shiny Bengaline fabric for my main fabric, you basically cut that same pattern piece out of another piece of fabric. And for my main body of my suit, I underlined it all in a basic broadcloth fabric, which was, you know, it's a thinner fabric, but it still does add some transparent opaqueness to the somewhat kind of transparent Bengaline, and also adds this nice back layer that is helpful to hand stitch down your seam allowances after you're done. So if you can see, I have little hand stitching here. This is called a catch stitch, and I've sewn my seam allowance just to this underlining layer, which is really helpful for this fabric because this fabric is kind of stiff. It likes to sit up like this, so doing this catch stitch helps it lay flat. And a catch stitch, if you don't know what it is, basically you take your needle and you go backwards, and then you do little stitches, zigzagging over top of whatever edge you're working with. So I started here, I did a little back stitch there, then I went here, back stitched in my seam allowance, then went into the underlining and back stitch and back stitch. It also helps you do a blind hem really nicely. So here's my hem that I have sewn, and I've only attached it to this underlining. The underlining allows you to get a nice big sewing stitch inside the lining. If you didn't have this layer, you'd have to only take a little itty bitty prick into the main fabric, and that can break easy. But this gives you a nice thick stitch that'll make that a nice blind hem. That means there's no top stitching on that. And another benefit of having the underlying layer is you can iron on the back of it, which is very helpful. Again, it depends on what fabrics you're using, but here is my underlining layer right here on the underlining side, and I've underlined this with a cotton canvas for something thicker, and I can use a higher heat setting when I'm ironing this on the back than if I was able to just iron it from the front because of the polyester. So that's another added bonus. Yeah, so this has got a cotton backing to it, so I can iron it from the back, and that helps. So in order to do your underlining, you take whatever fabric you want on the back. I did a basic broadcloth for all the main parts of the garment, but for the front piece, this is my front top piece, and this is my front skirt. I want a little bit more body. So rather than using a fusible interfacing, which especially it didn't really work for me with this polyester because of the high heat settings I had to use to get it to stick, and it would bubble, and it took a long time, and so this was much quicker, and it turned out to look a lot better. So I use a thick cotton canvas fabric for the places that I want to be a little stiffer. You cut out the same pattern for your underlining as your main. Then you would pin it together, and then you need to zigzag along the edges. So I've got a piece here in my sewing machine, and basically you want the zigzag to be, the width to be as wide as possible, and medium high length to it. And basically you're just zigzagging the edges of your of the pieces together. Now this can be a little tricky. I went to this part to show you. When you're putting two pieces of fabric together, they have different weaves. They might have different ways they react in the grain. So sometimes things buckle or not. One thing that helps is to stitch with the fabric that's got the stiffest, most stable weave on the top, which I've got the cotton on the top and the bengaline that seems to move around a little bit more on the bottom. But the other thing you need to remember to realize is this isn't a seam that you're sewing. You're just sewing over the edges to join them and also to finish off this edge, which you would need to zigzag around this piece of fabric anyway, even if you weren't doing underlining, because it unravels. So basically the only extra steps you have are to cut out the underlining and pin it to it, but you'd still have to zigzag the edges. So you just have to, if it starts to buckle a little, just move it a little bit forward, and all you're doing is trying to just join those pieces together. You don't have to have a consistent seam. And when you iron it at the end, you can probably get a little bit of those bucklings out. Alright, so that's zigzagging. Again, I'm going over the edge, you can see, and joining those two pieces together. So, and again, that I used a thicker canvas, so instead of using a fusible interfacing, that's going to be my interfacing. And I will give you, once I get all this in, I'll show you what the end product looks like. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, please ask. I am happy to help. Bye. Okay, so I have put in, this is the finished front, and this was the canvas underlining that I had on these front pieces, and plus if you notice, they are faced with the same fabric too. So that also, that using that fabric adds some thickness too. So that's what that looks like. So I did the canvas and these front pieces, and the rest of it is underlined in the under the broadcloth, I mean, and the sleeves are underlined too in the broadcloth. So all the parts. I did want to mention something about the collar, which is what I'm doing next. The collar I'm going to use, it depends on what your collar is supposed to look. If it's going to be supposed to be really stiff, you can still use this method of sewing it in. But I want to tell you that if you're going to use a stiff interfacing, that's completely fine. You can still cut out your same pattern piece from it. And then, but you don't want to zigzag the edges of your pattern piece. You don't want to attach your interfacing to the one piece. You just want to sandwich them all together. So you want to have your right sides of your two fashion fabrics together, and then whatever you're going to use as your interfacing on the back side of one of those pieces. And so I'm still just using the cotton canvas for this because this isn't a stiff collar, but I did just make a stiff collar, and I just used the stiff interfacing, cut out the same, and then don't zigzag it, just leave it edge, because after you sew it, so I've sewn the collar seam on this piece, you're going to trim down the interfacing that you're using down really close to the seam. So you're just going to get that out to get that extra body out. You don't want it to show up when you're when you turn the collar. You don't want to see a big edge from that interfacing, and you'll be trimming down the seam allowances, the back seam allowance of your collar too. So also, if you just have interfacing that you want to use to make it stiff, and Then another thing you could do is you could still use an underlining. Instead of using maybe the cotton, just use your broadcloth and cut out your interfacing. Your interfacing would be basically the same as your collar, but removing the seam allowances. And you can fuse your interfacing to the broadcloth rather than having to fuse it to the fashion fabric, because it might bubble on the fashion fabric. And also, if you're using a fashion fabric like this, it's polyester, it can be hard to get it to adhere with the higher temperatures, but it'd be easier to get it to adhere to something like a cotton. So that's another way you can still use interfacing, but the underlining can help. Rather than adhering the fusible interfacing to the actual fabric, you can adhere it to your underlying fabric. And that's what I do actually with my hats that I make. I make hats that have to have a stiff interfacing in it, and I have another layer of the underlining, and I fuse my interfacing to the underlining, not the fashion fabric. Alright. I have some more underlining tips for you in another costume. I'll get to it later. I think that's all I want to say. Alright, bye. Okay, so here's the final collar. Again, all I did was underline it / interface it with cotton canvas, so I didn't have to fuse down. I just made, I cut another piece, pattern piece from my collar parts out of that canvas and sandwiched them with the main pattern parts, and just sewed those seams with all those in, and then trimmed down all the cotton canvas. And that's what it looks like at the end. This is the look that I see in the movie. If it was real stiff, like the director, Imperial Officer tunic, then I would have used a stiff interfacing inside of it, but I still would sew it down rather than fuse it. Because fusing on white, you risk the chance of burning it and ruining your fabric, and so... this is another costume I make that I underline, and this is an example where underlining is essential because this is made from a crinkle cotton fabric that is very stretchy, and you have to underline it with a fabric that is not stretchy. So again, I have used a cotton muslin, well, this is Kona cotton here, a nice quilter's cotton, and I have underlined that whole thing, the tabers, the neck binding here, all is underlined to stabilize it. And if you had a suit fabric that you found that was the right color, but maybe it had a little stretch in it and you didn't want to stretch, then underlining and interfacing with the fabric here would definitely help that not stretch too. So that's another helpful hint for making the suits. But for this one, I've underlined it with the cotton, and again, it's that nice feature that you have that layer there to do your hand-sewn blind hems here, and you get no stitching from the front because that top layer is loose. And the nice thing about this too here is, especially with this fabric, what I showed you before, that you can iron the back side, and if your back fabric is like a cotton, you can put a little heat setting on it that is higher. Well, even this is a smaller version. This is my son's version. I did not line it like my husband here because my son's only 4. But you can see clearly that this is the underlining here. This is just a muslin I use for his. And what's nice about this is I can, to get these wrinkles out when I iron it, I can just make sure I get all the wrinkles out when I fold it, and then I can press it on this side, the side that is the muslin, and I don't risk ruining all the crinkles and stuff on the other side by ironing it. So that's another plus of doing the underlining, especially on a super stretchy, unique material like this crinkle cotton. Alright, if you have any other questions, please let me know. So underlining helps stabilize your fabrics. It adds body to your jacket or your tunic. So if you're using something that's a little thin, it adds, you could If you have thick fabric, you add thin underlining to it. If you have a thin, you can add thicker. It really just complements. Oh, and one more thing I'll mention. If you are planning to wash the garment, you want to make sure that you wash all of your fabrics before you start making your garment and wash them how you plan on washing them. So this, I did wash my crinkle cotton and my muslin before I made that. And I'm going to attempt to put it in the washer maybe to see how it works. But when you have the lining in it, and especially with suits, dry cleaning is the best. If you want to still use fusible interfacing, you can, and it's really nice if you do the underlining, because then you can fuse the interfacing pieces to the underlining, and that helps especially when you have a fabric that's like polyester or has a low heat setting, and you could use an underlining that's cotton that's higher, and so you could fuse it to those cotton pieces, and plus fusing it to the underlining. If you mess it up and it melts or something like that, then you haven't ruined your main fabric. You just cut another piece of much cheaper broadcloth. So you can still use fusible interfacing, but just attach it to the underlining. That's exactly what I do with the hats that I make. I have one. Just a sec. Okay, here's one of the original hats that I made before I even put lining in them, so you can actually see the inside versus the outside. And so I have my main fabric on the outside, and then I have underlined it with a cotton canvas, and then you can't tell, but inside, attached to the cotton canvas, is my stiff interfacing. And you can tell the difference because you can see like these crinkling that happens when you add like a stiff fusible interfacing. It kind of has that look to it after the fabric has been adhered to it. And so it's nice to put that on an underlining, because then you don't have that look on your main fabric. Your main fabric still stays as smooth. This has been in a box, so kind of got a little bent up, but your main fabric can stay smoother, and then you get all that crinkling and stuff, and that look like that the fusible interfacing that can give to the fabrics is all in the hat. And then now I line these so you don't see that. So this is an underlining, the black that you see. Underneath, in between these layers, is a stiff fusible interfacing. I find fusible is just fine. I like to use it for hats because the pieces are small. I can just put my iron on it and let it go. When it gets into a bigger area that you have to press all over and stuff like that, then it's not as friendly for me. And for this hat in particular, I need the stiffness of that fusible to get that shape. All right, any other questions you have about underlining or interfacing, anything, please let me know. I'd be happy to help. I taught sewing construction when I was in my graduate school, and I have degrees in costume design, apparel design, and costume construction, and so I've got a lot of experience and lots of basic know-how of things that I've learned and things I've figured out over the years. So happy to help. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.